Captain Isaiah Washington freezes as he recognizes the voices behind him in the first-class cabin. The same couple who tried to get him removed from piloting their flight now desperately need his help. Their lives literally in his hands, they don't recognize the unqualified black pilot they reported. Before we dive into this incredible story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let me know in the comments which airline you fly most often. Trust me, after hearing what happened to Captain Washington, you might see your next flight differently. Isaiah Washington never intended to become a legend in commercial aviation. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia, his fascination with flight began when his father took him to an air show at age 8. That day, watching the planes slice through the clouds, young Isaiah made a promise to himself that one day he would command the skies. At 45, Captain Washington had not only fulfilled that childhood dream, but had surpassed it in ways his younger self could never have imagined. After graduating with honors from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, he had served with distinction in the Air Force for 8 years, piloting everything from cargo planes to fighter jets in combat situations that tested both his skill and composure. When he transitioned to commercial aviation 15 years ago, Isaiah brought with him not just thousands of flight hours, but an unparalleled understanding of aircraft mechanics and emergency procedures. His attention to detail and calm under pressure caught the attention of Horizon Airlines executives almost immediately. There was something different about Washington, remembered Franklin Reynolds, now CEO of Horizon. He wasn't just flying planes, he was thinking 3 steps ahead, predicting problems before they happened, seeing patterns the rest of us missed. Within 5 years, Isaiah had risen through the ranks to become the youngest chief training captain in Horizon's history. It wasn't just his flying that set him apart, it was his ability to teach, to break down complex maneuvers and emergency responses into methodical steps that other pilots could master. The training program Isaiah developed revolutionized how Horizon prepared its pilots. His simulation scenarios became industry standard, and his emergency response protocols were adopted by airlines across the country. His methods cut training time by 20% while improving safety outcomes dramatically. For the past decade, every single captain in Horizon's fleet had passed through Isaiah's program, learning to fly with the precision and judgment that had become his trademark. Despite his accomplishments, Isaiah never escaped the reality of being a black man in an industry where less than 3% of commercial pilots shared his skin color. The suspicious glances in airport lounges, the surprise on passengers' faces when they glimpsed him in the cockpit, the occasional complaint to flight attendants. These were all part of his professional existence. "You learn to wear 2 uniforms," Isaiah once told a group of aspiring pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. "The captain's uniform everyone can see, and the emotional armor that makes it possible to keep showing up with a smile when people question your right to be there." At home, Isaiah found solace and support in his wife of 18 years, Tamara, a pediatric surgeon who understood what it meant to excel in spaces where few looked like you. Their daughter Zoe, 16 and already interested in aerospace engineering, had grown up watching her father navigate both the technical challenges of flight and the social challenges of racism with the same steady hand. Isaiah's philosophy had always been simple excellence as resistance. Every perfect landing, every smooth flight through turbulence, every correctly anticipated mechanical issue was his answer to the doubt that followed him through airport terminals. This philosophy had earned him the recent assignment to Horizon's prestigious New York to Paris route, typically reserved for the airline's most experienced captains. The overnight flight carried business executives, diplomats, and wealthy tourists across the Atlantic, and Isaiah saw each successful crossing as another brick in the foundation of his legacy. Little did he know that his next flight would test not just his flying abilities, but his commitment to that philosophy of excellence in ways he could never have anticipated. Terminal 4 at JFK International Airport buzzed with its usual chaotic energy as Flight 1676 to Paris prepared for boarding. At Gate B23, the gate agents processed the line of passengers, while Isaiah completed his pre-flight checks in the cockpit of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Among those waiting in the priority boarding line stood Garrett and Beverly Preston. At 58 and 55 respectively, the couple projected the confident air of people accustomed to wealth and its privileges. Garrett, a senior investment banker with silver-streaked hair and a tailored Brioni suit, checked his Rolex impatiently, while Beverly adjusted her Hermes scarf and scrolled through emails on her phone. "I don't understand why they can't board on time," Garrett muttered. "We pay enough for these tickets to expect punctuality." Beverly nodded sympathetically. "Darling, you know how these things go. At least we'll have champagne soon." When the gate agent finally called for first-class boarding, the Prestons moved forward with the practiced efficiency of frequent flyers. They handed over their boarding passes, walked down the jet bridge, and turned right into the first-class cabin where flight attendant Kayla Bennett welcomed them with a professional smile. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Preston. You'll be in seats 2 Amperes and 2B. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" "Champagne for both of us," Garrett replied, without looking up from his phone. The couple settled into their spacious seats, placing their carry-ons in the overhead compartments. As Beverly arranged her travel pillow, her gaze drifted toward the open cockpit door where Isaiah sat, going through his final preparations, his captain's hat resting on the console beside him. She nudged her husband. "Garrett," she whispered, nodding toward the cockpit. Garrett looked up, his expression shifting from distracted to concerned. As he observed Isaiah, he leaned closer to his wife. "Is he our pilot?" he whispered back, his voice carrying just enough for the passengers in nearby seats to hear. "Looks like it," Beverly replied, her voice lowered but not enough. "I've never seen a black captain on an international flight before." Garrett's brow furrowed. Maybe he's just the co-pilot. Their murmured conversation continued as Kayla returned with her champagne. Beverly touched the flight attendant's arm as she placed the drinks on their tray tables. "Excuse me," Beverly said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Could I ask you something privately?" Kayla leaned down, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Of course, Mrs. Preston." The pilot, Beverly, began glancing toward the cockpit. "Is he qualified for this route? This is a long international flight, and we just want to make sure we're in good hands." Kayla straightened her smile, tightening almost imperceptibly. "Captain Washington is one of our most experienced pilots, ma'am. You're in excellent hands." Garrett joined the conversation, his voice taking on a concerned fatherly tone that poorly masked his actual sentiments. "We don't mean any disrespect, but this is an important trip for us. We just want to verify his experience level. Has he flown this route before?" "Many times," Sir Kayla replied, her tone cooling. "Captain Washington has over 15,000 flight hours and has been with Horizon for 15 years. "I see," Garrett said, not entirely convinced. "It's just unusual, that's all." "Unusual?" Kayla asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "You know," Beverly interjected, lowering her voice further. "We don't typically see someone like him as the captain, especially not on international flights." From his position in the cockpit, Isaiah couldn't hear every word, but he recognized the familiar pattern of the conversation, the lowered voices, the concerned glances in his direction, the flight attendants' increasingly defensive posture. He'd seen it countless times throughout his career. As Kayla moved away from the Prestons to assist other passengers, Isaiah took a deep breath and focused on his pre-flight checklist. The words on the page blurred momentarily as he felt the familiar sting of these encounters. Not the sharp pain of overt racism, but the dull, persistent ache of having to constantly prove his worthiness. He thought briefly of calling his wife, as he sometimes did before difficult flights, but decided against it. Tamara would be in surgery now anyway, saving some child's life, while he dealt with passengers questioning his competence because of his skin color. Isaiah adjusted his captain's hat and straightened his shoulders. Whatever these passengers thought of him, he had a job to do, and he would do it with the excellence that had defined his career. The flight to Paris would be smooth, safe, and precisely on schedule, his only response to the doubt cast on his abilities. Little did he know how dramatically that commitment would be tested in the hours to come. "I'd like to speak with a manager," Garrett Preston's voice carried through the first-class cabin as boarding continued. Kayla, who had been helping an elderly passenger stow her bag, turned with a tightly controlled expression. "Is there a problem with your seats, Mr. Preston?" "This isn't about the seats," he replied loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is about passenger safety and airline standards. My wife and I have concerns that need to be addressed before takeoff." Beverly touched her husband's arm. "No," Garrett responded firmly. "If we're putting our lives in someone's hands, we have every right to ensure they're qualified. I want to speak with whoever's in charge of this flight." Kayla nodded once, her professional smile now firmly fixed in place. "I'll get our operations manager for you, sir. Please, give me a moment." As she made her way to the front of the plane, Kayla paused at the cockpit door. "Captain Washington, we have a situation with the passengers in 2 Amperes and 2B. Isaiah looked up from his instruments. "The Prestons." "Yes, sir. They're asking to speak with management about—" She hesitated. "About your qualifications." Isaiah nodded, unsurprised. "Call Derek. Let's handle this by the book." In the cockpit beside Isaiah sat First Officer Jordan Martinez, a young pilot who had come through Isaiah's training program just 3 years earlier. Jordan's face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, adjusting his headset with more force than necessary. "They wouldn't be questioning you if you were white." "Easy, Martinez," Isaiah replied calmly. "It's not the first time, won't be the last. Let's focus on getting this bird in the air on schedule." Within minutes, Derek Coleman, Horizon's operations manager at JFK, arrived at the gate and boarded the plane. Tall and authoritative in his company suit, Derek made his way to the Preston seats, with Kayla trailing behind him. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston, I'm Derek Coleman, operations manager for Horizon at JFK. I understand you have some concerns." Garrett stood to shake Derek's hand. "Yes, thank you for coming so promptly. My wife and I have some questions about the captain's experience and qualifications for this route." Derek's expression remained neutral. "Captain Washington is one of our most senior pilots, sir. I can assure you he's more than qualified for this flight." "With all due respect," Beverly interjected, her voice honeyed but her eyes cold. "We fly this route frequently and we've never seen someone like him in command before. We'd just like to verify his credentials." By now, other passengers were openly watching the exchange. A businessman across the aisle frowned in disapproval at the Prestons, while a young couple, a few rows back, whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Someone like him," Derek repeated, his tone carefully measured. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Mrs. Preston." "You know exactly what we mean," Garrett said, lowering his voice slightly but maintaining his imperious tone. "We're not comfortable with an inexperienced pilot, and frankly, we're surprised at Horizon's hiring choices for such an important route." Derek straightened his shoulders, his professional demeanor still intact but noticeably cooler. "Captain Washington has been with Horizon for 15 years, sir. He's piloted this exact route over 200 times without incident. In fact, if he's so qualified," Beverly interrupted, "we'd like to see his credentials. That's not an unreasonable request when our safety is concerned." By now, boarding was nearly complete, and the departure time was approaching. Derek glanced at his watch, then back at the Prestons. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston, I can provide you with Captain Washington's flight hours and certification status, but I'm afraid I can't delay this flight for a credential review That isn't part of our standard protocol. If you're uncomfortable flying with our assigned captain, I'd be happy to rebook you on tomorrow's flight, though I can't guarantee a different pilot." Garrett's face reddened. "Are you suggesting we deplane after paying premium prices for these tickets?" "Not at all, sir," Derek replied smoothly. "I'm merely offering options. You're welcome to stay on board with the assurance that Captain Washington is fully qualified, or you can choose to take a different flight if you prefer." The standoff continued for several tense moments before Beverly placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm. "We'll stay," she said finally, "but we'll be filing a formal complaint with customer service about this situation." Derek nodded. "That's certainly your right, ma'am. Is there anything else I can help you with before we prepare for departure?" The Prestons, momentarily outmaneuvered but still seething, shook their heads. As Derek turned to leave, he caught Kayla's eye and gave her a subtle nod of support. In the cockpit, Jordan was still fuming as Derek stopped by to brief Isaiah on the situation. "They're staying on board," Derek informed him, "but they're not happy about it." Isaiah nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for handling it, Derek. We'll get everyone to Paris safely, regardless of how they feel about who's flying the plane." As Derek left and the cabin crew prepared for departure, Jordan turned to his captain.
"How do you stay so calm? I wanted to go out there and tell them exactly where they could shove their complaints."
Isaiah allowed himself a small smile as he completed his final checks. "In this job, Martinez, you learn that the best response to people questioning your abilities isn't anger, it's performance. We're going to give the Prestons the smoothest, safest flight they've ever had. That's how we answer." With that, Isaiah reached for the intercom to make his pre-flight announcement, his voice calm, confident, and professional giving. No indication of the drama that had preceded takeoff or the storm that lay ahead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Isaiah Washington speaking. On behalf of Horizon Airlines, I welcome you aboard Flight 1676 to Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport. Our flight time today will be approximately 7 hours and 20 minutes. We're expecting mostly clear conditions across the Atlantic with some light turbulence about halfway through our journey. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 39,000 feet. The current time in Paris is 7:35 a.m. and the forecast calls for partly cloudy skies with a temperature of 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. We should be at our gate right on schedule at 10:40 a.m. local time. The cabin crew will now demonstrate the safety features of this aircraft. Thank you for choosing Horizon Airlines. We'll be taking off shortly." Isaiah's voice echoed through the cabin, steady, authoritative, and professional. As he set down the intercom, he caught a glimpse of the Prestons in their first-class seats, their faces set in matching expressions of thinly veiled displeasure. The rumble of the Boeing 787's engines filled the cockpit as Isaiah and Jordan completed their final preparations for takeoff. Despite the calm exterior he presented, Isaiah couldn't help but feel the familiar weight of having to prove himself yet again. How many perfect flights would it take before people like the Prestons saw his competence before his color? Runways clear, Jordan reported, his voice pulling Isaiah back to the present. "We're good to go." Isaiah nodded, focusing his attention where it belonged, on the complex machine under his command and the hundreds of lives temporarily in his care. "Let's get her in the air." The takeoff was flawless, a smooth acceleration down the runway, followed by a gentle ascent that barely registered with the passengers. As the aircraft climbed through the cloud layer, the lights of New York City spread out below them like a glittering constellation before gradually disappearing behind the clouds. In the first-class cabin, Kayla moved with practiced efficiency, serving drinks and checking on passengers. When she reached the Prestons, her smile remained perfectly professional despite their earlier behavior. "Can I get you anything to drink?" she asked. Beverly glanced up from her magazine. "White wine, please. And my husband will have a scotch." "Of course." "And how are you finding the flight so far?" Kayla inquired, maintaining the hospitality her position required. "The takeoff was acceptable," Garrett replied stiffly, not bothering to look up from his laptop. Kayla nodded and moved on to the next passenger, exchanging a knowing glance with her colleague Marco, who was serving the other aisle. Back in the cockpit, Isaiah settled into the rhythm of the flight, his hands resting lightly on the controls as the autopilot engaged. This was where he felt most at home, surrounded by instruments and gauges responsible for a journey that would carry hundreds of people safely across an ocean. The memory of a similar incident early in his career surfaced unexpectedly. He had been a first officer, then flying a regional route from Atlanta to Chicago. An elderly passenger had taken one look at him and asked if someone else could fly the plane. The captain that day, an older white man named Frank Richardson, had firmly told the passenger that Isaiah was one of the best pilots he'd ever flown with. And if the passenger wasn't comfortable with that, he was welcome to take a string bus to Chicago instead. That show of solidarity had meant the world to the young Isaiah. Frank had later become one of his mentors, encouraging him to pursue leadership positions within the airline. "This industry needs to change," Frank had told him. "And it won't change unless people like you stick around long enough to change it." Isaiah had taken those words to heart, staying in commercial aviation despite the countless micro and macro aggressions he'd faced over the years. Now, as chief training captain, he made sure every pilot who came through his program understood that aviation belonged to everyone, with the skill and dedication to pursue it, regardless of their race, gender, or background. Captain Jordan's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Weather report shows that turbulence might start earlier than expected, about an hour from now rather than 2. Isaiah nodded. "Let's adjust our route slightly to the north. That should give us a smoother ride." As the aircraft cruised at 39,000 feet, the cabin settled into the quiet routine of a long-haul night flight. The lights dimmed, passengers reclined their seats, and flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, attending to those still awake. Have you ever been in a situation where someone doubted your abilities because of your race, gender, or background? Comment number 1 if you've experienced this type of prejudice firsthand, or number 2 if you've witnessed it happening to someone else. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to be judged solely on their skills and character. And subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience against discrimination. But what do you think would happen if those who questioned Captain Washington's abilities suddenly found their lives depending on his expertise? What would unfold if the very people who tried to have him removed from the flight were forced to trust him with their survival? The unexpected turn of events that comes next will test everyone on board. Flight 1676. 3 hours into the flight, the vast Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly below as Flight 1676 cruised through the night. Most of the passengers had settled into sleep, their seats reclined, and cabin lights dimmed to create the illusion of night despite the aircraft chasing the sunrise across time zones. In the first-class cabin, Beverly Preston dozed fitfully, while Garrett reviewed documents on his tablet. Neither had mentioned their concerns about the captain again, though Garrett had made a point of loudly complaining about minor turbulence they'd encountered an hour earlier, muttering something about route planning within earshot of the cabin crew. The cockpit was quiet except for the steady hum of instruments and occasional radio communications with other aircraft crossing the Atlantic. Isaiah and Jordan maintained the vigilant monitoring that was second nature to experienced pilots even during the routine cruise phase of the flight. "How's your kid doing with those college applications?" Isaiah asked, making conversation during the long stretch. Jordan smiled, stressed out but managing. Her heart set on MIT and her grades should get her in, but you know how it is. Isaiah nodded about to respond when a subtle change in the aircraft's vibration caught his attention. Most passengers wouldn't notice it, just the slightest increase in the engine's pitch on the right side of the aircraft. To an experienced pilot like Isaiah, however, it was like hearing a wrong note in a familiar piece of music. He frowned, eyes scanning the instrument panel. "You feel that?" Jordan nodded, already checking the engine parameters. Engine 2's pressure reading is fluctuating. Within seconds, both pilots were fully alert, methodically assessing the situation. The right engine's readings showed minor but concerning irregularities. Nothing immediately catastrophic, but definitely requiring attention. "Let's run the checklist for engine anomalies," Isaiah directed calmly, his years of experience evident in his measured response. As they worked through the procedural checks, the vibration grew more pronounced. Warning indicators began to illuminate on the console, confirming what Isaiah had suspected from that first subtle change in sound. They were developing a potentially serious issue with the right engine. Pressures continuing to drop, Jordan reported his voice professional but tense. Temperatures rising above normal parameters. Isaiah nodded, making rapid calculations. They were approximately halfway across the Atlantic, equidistant from the eastern seaboard of North America and the western edge of Europe, the most isolated point of their journey. "Contact air traffic control," he instructed Jordan. "Let them know we're experiencing engine anomalies and may need to consider options." As Jordan established communication with ATC, Isaiah continued monitoring the deteriorating engine situation. Years of training and experience told him this wasn't something that would resolve itself. They were looking at a potential engine failure mid-ocean. Gander Center Horizon 1676 Jordan spoke into his headset. "We're experiencing right engine irregularities. Request weather and airport information for possible diversion points." The controller's voice came back clear through their headsets. "Horizon 1676, we copy your situation. Stand by for diversion options. Can you provide more details on your engine status?" While Jordan relayed the technical information, Isaiah made a quick decision. "We need to brief the cabin crew. Call the senior flight attendant to the cockpit." Minutes later, Kayla entered the cockpit, her expression shifting from routine professionalism to concern as she registered the atmosphere and the warning lights visible on the instrument panel. "We have an engine situation," Isaiah explained concisely. "Right now, it's manageable, but it's deteriorating. We may need to divert to Gander in Newfoundland." Kayla absorbed this with the composure of a veteran crew member. "What do you need from the cabin crew, Captain?" "Nothing alarming yet, but have the team begin quiet preparations. Review emergency procedures, secure any loose items, and be ready for an announcement to the passengers within the next 15 minutes. As Kayla left to brief her team, the engine's condition continued to worsen. The vibration had become noticeable enough that some passengers were stirring from their sleep, looking around with confused expressions. "Oil pressures dropping rapidly," Jordan reported. "We're looking at metal contamination in the system." Isaiah made his decision. "We're diverting to Gander, confirm with ATC, and begin plotting our approach." Just as Jordan began the communication, a sudden, loud bang reverberated through the aircraft, followed by a more violent shudder that rippled from the right wing through the entire fuselage. The right engine's parameters spiked into critical zones, and multiple warning alerts activated simultaneously. In the cabin, the sound and subsequent shaking jolted passengers awake. Exclamations of fear and confusion filled the previously quiet space as oxygen masks dropped automatically from the ceiling panels in response to the sudden change in the aircraft systems. Engine 2's failing Isaiah stated, his hands moving rapidly across the controls, already implementing emergency procedures. "We've lost over 60% power on the right side." The aircraft began to shake more persistently, and a slight rightward yaw developed as the engines no longer produced balanced thrust. Isaiah compensated smoothly, maintaining the aircraft's course while beginning a controlled descent. Gander Center Jordan's voice remained professional despite the tension. "Horizon 1676 declaring an emergency. We've experienced a partial engine failure and require immediate clearance for approach to Gander International. As the emergency unfolded, panic spread through the cabin. The sudden awakening to alarm shaking and dropping oxygen masks created instant chaos. In first class, Beverly Preston clutched her husband's arm, her face pale with terror. "What's happening?" she gasped, the earlier complaints about the pilot forgotten in the face of immediate fear. Garrett, equally shaken, shook his head. "I don't know. Something's wrong with the plane." Kayla and the other flight attendants moved through the cabin with urgent professionalism, instructing passengers to fasten seatbelts, don oxygen masks if needed, and remain calm. The practiced phrases of their emergency training now deployed in a real crisis. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isaiah's voice came through the intercom, steady and authoritative despite the circumstances. "This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a technical issue with one of our engines and will be diverting to Gander International Airport in Newfoundland as a precautionary measure. The aircraft is designed to fly safely on a single engine, and we are in full control of the situation. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelt securely fastened and follow all instructions from the cabin crew. We expect to land in approximately 40 minutes. I'll provide more information as it becomes available." His calm delivery helped stabilize the mood in the cabin somewhat, though the continued vibration and the knowledge that they were over the middle of the ocean maintained the undercurrent of fear. In the cockpit, Isaiah and Jordan worked with the practiced coordination of professionals handling an emergency they had trained for repeatedly. Isaiah knew that the next 40 minutes would test every aspect of his flying ability and leadership. The lives of everyone on board now depended on his capacity to manage a crippled aircraft and bring it safely to an airport he hadn't planned to visit in conditions that were rapidly becoming more challenging. As he adjusted the aircraft systems to compensate for the failing engine, a brief image of the Prestons flashed through his mind, their earlier disdain now replaced by dependence on the very skills they had questioned. But there was no satisfaction in this irony. Only a renewed focus on the task at hand. Everyone on this plane, those who respected him and those who didn't, deserved his absolute best performance now. With that thought, Isaiah Washington tightened his grip on the controls and began the most challenging flight of his distinguished career. The situation aboard Flight 1676 deteriorated rapidly over the next 20 minutes. The partial engine failure had progressed to a complete shutdown of the right engine, leaving the aircraft flying on a single power source over the dark, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic. "Engine 2 is completely offline." Jordan confirmed, his voice tight but controlled, as they monitored the cascade of systems affected by the power loss. "We're getting multiple hydraulic warnings now." Isaiah nodded, his hand steady on the controls as he compensated for the asymmetrical thrust. The Boeing 787 was designed to fly safely on a single engine, but the loss of secondary hydraulic systems complicated their situation significantly. The aircraft felt heavy and sluggish under his hands, responding more slowly to his inputs than normal. How far to Gander, he asked, his focus absolute, as he maintained their controlled descent. 170 nautical miles, Jordan replied after checking their navigation system. About 35 minutes at current speed. Isaiah processed this information against the aircraft's deteriorating condition. The vibrations had intensified, suggesting that damage from the engine failure might be affecting other components in the right wing. More concerning weather reports showed a fast-moving storm system near Gander with high winds and poor visibility, far from ideal conditions for an emergency landing in a compromised aircraft. "Gander approach horizon 1676, Jordan communicated, requesting updated weather and runway information. Be advised, we've lost hydraulic system B in addition to complete failure of engine 2. The controller's response came back with professional clarity. "Horizon 1676 Gander approach." Weather deteriorating rapidly. Wind gusting to 40 knots, visibility reduced to 3 miles in heavy rain. Runway 13 is active with approach lighting at full intensity. Emergency services standing by. Be advised we're clearing all other traffic. In the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from initial panic to a tense, quiet dread. The continuous shuddering of the aircraft and its noticeable tilt to one side made the severity of their situation impossible to ignore. Flight attendants moved through the aisles checking seatbelts and attempting to project calm despite their own concerns. In seat 2, B. Beverly Preston sat rigid with fear, her knuckles white as she gripped both the armrest and her husband's hand. Garrett's earlier arrogance had evaporated completely, replaced by a pallor that matched his wife's. "Are we going to be okay?" Beverly whispered, her voice barely audible over the strained sound of the remaining engine. Before Garrett could answer, a violent shudder ran through the aircraft, stronger than any previous turbulence. Overhead bins popped open, spilling contents into the aisles. Oxygen masks dropped again in several sections of the cabin. Screams and prayers filled the air as the plane seemed to momentarily drop before stabilizing. "We've lost partial pressure in hydraulic system," a Jordan reported urgently in the cockpit. "Flight controls are getting sluggish." Isaiah felt the change immediately through the control yoke, which now required significantly more force to achieve the same response from the aircraft. They were facing a cascading failure. The engine problem had triggered damage to multiple systems, each new failure placing more stress on the remaining components. In this critical moment, Isaiah's mind became crystal clear, time seeming to slow as years of training and experience converged. He recalled the specific emergency protocol he had developed for the airline's training program 3 years earlier, a protocol for precisely this scenario of progressive system failure following engine loss. "Switch to manual reversion on the remaining hydraulics," he instructed Jordan. "We'll need to conserve pressure for the landing gear and flaps." As Jordan executed these commands, Isaiah calculated their approach to Gander. With compromised systems, they would have essentially one chance to line up with the runway correctly. The margin for error had shrunk to nearly zero. Isaiah reached for the intercom. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing in 20 minutes. This will be a firmer landing than normal. Secure all loose items and double-check all passenger restraints." In the first-class cabin, Kayla acknowledged the instruction and began final preparations. As she passed the Prestons, she noticed Beverly in the midst of a panic attack, her breathing rapid and shallow tears streaming down her face. "She needs help," Garrett pleaded, his previous condescension replaced by desperate concern. "Please, isn't there something you can give her?" Kayla knelt beside them. "Mrs. Preston, I need you to breathe with me. Slowly, in through your nose, out through your mouth." She demonstrated the technique while retrieving an oxygen bottle from a nearby compartment. "Are we going to crash?" Beverly managed, between gasping breaths. "The plane keeps shaking. Something's wrong." "We're experiencing mechanical difficulties," Kayla explained, calmly placing the oxygen mask over Beverly's face. "But Captain Washington is one of our most experienced pilots, especially in emergency situations." Garrett looked up sharply at this. "The black captain. He's handling this." "Yes, sir," Kayla replied, her tone professional despite her frustration at his persistent bias, even in crisis. "And you should know that Captain Washington wrote the emergency protocol that all our pilots follow in situations like this. He literally wrote the manual on how to handle this exact scenario." Before Garrett could respond, another violent shudder rocked the aircraft. The remaining engine whined as it strained to compensate for increased demands. In the cockpit, warning lights illuminated across the panel as the flight control system reported further degradation. "We're losing effectiveness on the ailerons," Jordan reported tensely. "Roll control is minimal." Isaiah's face remained composed as he physically wrestled with the increasingly unresponsive controls. This was the moment when instinct and experience transcended standard procedures, when a pilot's true skill was measured not by how well they followed a checklist, but by how they adapted when the checklist wasn't enough. We can't make gander with these control issues and this weather, Isaiah decided, making rapid calculations. The approach is too complex with our current limitations. He studied their navigation display, searching for alternatives. There's Street Johns to the southeast. Simpler approach, slightly better weather, and we've got just enough fuel to make it. Street Johns is farther, Jordan pointed out. Are you sure we can maintain control that long? We don't have a choice, Isaiah replied, already adjusting their heading. Contact ATC with the change of plan. As Jordan relayed their decision to air traffic control, Isaiah focused entirely on keeping the damaged aircraft stable. Each minute required constant adjustments as the plane's handling characteristics continued to deteriorate. It was like trying to drive a car with a flat tire and failing power steering, requiring constant, exhausting compensation just to maintain a straight line. What no one in the cabin knew was that Isaiah was now flying almost entirely manually. The autopilot functions compromised by the cascading system failures. Every minute of the approach required his complete concentration and physical strength as the control surfaces grew increasingly resistant. 20 miles to Street Johns, Jordan, reported after what seemed like hours but had been just under 30 minutes of grueling flight. Weather's holding at minimums. Runway is clear, with emergency services standing by. Isaiah nodded, unable to spare the concentration for a verbal response. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool cockpit air as he fought to maintain their approach path. Cabin crew final approach, Jordan announced through the intercom. Brace for landing. In the cabin, the flight attendants moved through their final safety checks, demonstrating the brace position and securing any remaining loose items. The passengers, now fully aware of the gravity of their situation, followed instructions with unusual compliance. Beverly Preston, still clutching the oxygen mask to her face, looked out the window at the distant lights of Street Johns appearing through breaks in the clouds below. Beside her, Garrett sat in silence, his earlier complaints about their pilot now seeming not just misguided, but grotesquely unfair. As the aircraft ascended through 3,000 feet, Isaiah could see the runway approach lights through the rain-streaked windshield. Their approach was stable but precarious, the aircraft responding with decreasing reliability to his control inputs. "Gear down," he ordered, his voice steady, despite the physical strain of controlling the aircraft. Jordan confirmed the landing gear deployment, though one of the indicators showed amber rather than green, suggesting potential issues with the right main gear. 1,000 feet. Jordan called out, reading their altitude. Wind gusting to 35 knots. Slight crosswind from the right. Isaiah made no response. His entire being focused on the runway ahead and the feedback coming through his hands on the controls. In his 15 years at Horizon and 8 years in the Air Force, before that he had never needed to draw so deeply on his reserves of skill and concentration. The final approach was a masterclass in precision flying under extreme duress. Fighting crosswinds, compromised hydraulics, asymmetrical thrust, and potential landing gear issues. Isaiah guided the damaged aircraft down toward the runway, with micrometer adjustments to pitch power and rudder. At 50 feet above the runway, a sudden gust of wind threatened to push them sideways. Isaiah responded instantaneously, applying just enough rudder and aileron pressure to keep them aligned with the centerline without overcorrecting and risking a roll. 30 feet. 20. 10. Jordan called out, monitoring their sink rate. The touchdown, when it came, was firm but controlled, a testament to Isaiah's skill under impossible conditions. The aircraft settled onto the runway with a solid thump, the remaining engine immediately reversing thrust as Isaiah applied maximum braking. For several breathless seconds, the outcome remained uncertain as the aircraft decelerated with emergency vehicles racing alongside. Finally, the speed bled off sufficiently for Isaiah to guide the crippled plane onto a taxiway where he brought it to a complete stop. Only then, with the immediate danger past, did Isaiah Washington allow himself a deep breath. He had just pulled off what many would later call one of the most impressive emergency landings in commercial aviation history. In the sudden silence following engine shutdown, Jordan turned to his captain, awe evident in his expression. That was, he began, words failing him. Isaiah nodded, once professional to the core even in this moment of triumph. "Call ground services," he said simply. "Let's get our passengers safely off this aircraft." But as he unbuckled his harness and prepared to address the cabin, Isaiah couldn't help but wonder if the Prestons still questioned his qualifications to fly their plane. The terminal at St. John's International Airport buzzed with unusual activity for the early morning hours. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights surrounded the Horizon Airlines Boeing 787 that sat on a remote taxiway, its right engine visibly damaged, panels missing from sections of the wing. Airport staff had transformed a secondary terminal area into an impromptu reception center for the passengers of Flight 1676, with medical personnel evaluating anyone showing signs of distress. Inside this hastily arranged space, passengers gathered in small groups, many still processing their brush with disaster. Some made phone calls to worried family members, while others accepted blankets and hot beverages from airport staff. The shared experience of surviving the emergency landing had temporarily erased the usual boundaries between strangers, creating an atmosphere of mutual support and relief. Beverly Preston sat on a bench, a thermal blanket wrapped around her shoulders, despite the comfortable temperature in the terminal. Her hands still trembled slightly as she sipped from a paper cup of tea. Beside her, Garrett stood talking with Marco, one of the flight attendants, his earlier arrogance replaced by a subdued gratitude. "When will we be able to continue our journey?" he asked, his tone respectful in a way it hadn't been during boarding. Marco shook his head. "It's too early to say, sir. The airline is already making arrangements for a replacement aircraft, but it will take some time. Technical teams need to evaluate what happened, and there are safety protocols that must be followed." Garrett nodded, accepting this information without complaint, a stark contrast to his behavior just hours earlier. Across the room, Captain Isaiah Washington stood conferring with airport officials and Horizon's emergency response coordinator, who had been patched in via video call. Despite the ordeal he had just navigated, Isaiah maintained his professional composure, providing detailed information about the cascade of technical failures that had necessitated the emergency landing. The initial engine anomaly presented approximately 3 hours into the flight, he explained, gesturing to the aircraft diagram on a tablet. But the subsequent hydraulic failures suggest a possible manufacturing defect in the fuel line routing that may have damaged adjacent systems during the failure sequence. The officials nodded, making notes of his observations. Isaiah's technical precision and calm analytical approach in the aftermath impressed them as much as his flying skill had during the crisis. As this debriefing concluded, a commotion near the terminal entrance drew everyone's attention. A tall, distinguished man in his early 60s strode into the room, followed by several airline executives. His commanding presence and the deference shown by those around him immediately identified him as someone of significant authority. "That's Franklin Reynolds," one passenger whispered to another, "the CEO of Horizon Airlines." Indeed, Franklin Reynolds, who had been in Boston for a transportation industry conference, had immediately chartered a private jet to St. John's upon hearing about the emergency landing. Now he moved purposefully through the terminal, stopping briefly to speak with groups of passengers before making his way toward Isaiah. When the two men met, Reynolds grasped Isaiah's hand firmly in both of his. "Exceptional work," "Captain Washington," he said, his voice carrying through the suddenly quiet terminal. "Preliminary data shows you handled cascading failures that our simulators classify as potentially unsurvivable. Every person in this room owes you their life." Isaiah nodded, accepting the praise with characteristic humility. "Just doing my job, sir. And I couldn't have done it without First Officer Martinez and our cabin crew." Reynolds shook his head, a hint of emotion breaking through his executive demeanor. "No, Isaiah, this went well beyond the job. This was mastery." He turned to address the gathered passengers, his voice projecting to reach everyone in the terminal. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know exactly who brought you safely to the ground today. Captain Isaiah Washington isn't just one of our pilots. He's the backbone of our entire pilot training program. For the past decade, every single captain in Horizon's fleet has been trained personally by Captain Washington. The emergency protocols that guided our response today were developed by him." A murmur ran through the crowd as passengers processed this information. In the front row, Beverly Preston straightened slightly, her eyes widening as she looked at the captain with new understanding. Reynolds continued, "Captain Washington is without exaggeration the most skilled pilot in our entire airline. His emergency landing simulators are used by aviation authorities worldwide. When other airlines face incidents like today's, they call Isaiah Washington for consultation." As the CEO spoke, Garrett Preston felt a growing weight of shame settling in his chest. He glanced at his wife, seeing in her expression the same dawning realization the man whose competence they had questioned based solely on his race had just saved their lives, using skills so exceptional that even the airline CEO had traveled personally to acknowledge them. Reynolds concluded his impromptu speech by announcing Horizon will be arranging accommodation for everyone while we prepare a replacement aircraft. Our team will provide details shortly. In the meantime, I've authorized immediate access to our premium lounge facilities here at the airport and complimentary services during your stay." As Reynolds finished speaking and the crowd dispersed toward the indicated lounges, the Prestons remained frozen in place, the full impact of the CEO's words washing over them. Not only had Isaiah Washington saved their lives with his exceptional skill, but he was also responsible for training every pilot they had ever flown with on Horizon Airlines. Every safe landing they had ever experienced was in some way a testament to his expertise. Garrett Beverly whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "What have we done?" Garrett had no answer. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he found himself completely without justification for his actions. Across the terminal, Isaiah was finishing his conversation with Reynolds when Kayla approached them, her face serious. "Captain," she said quietly, "there's something you should know about the passengers in 2 Amperes and 2B. Isaiah nodded, having already pieced together the connection. "The ones who questioned my qualifications at boarding." "Yes, sir," Kayla confirmed. "They were quite insistent about speaking to management before takeoff. It was unpleasant." Reynolds frowned. "Was there a technical concern I should know about?" "No, sir," Kayla replied carefully. "Their concerns were specifically about Captain Washington's background. They made it clear they were uncomfortable with a black pilot on an international route." Reynolds' expression darkened. "I see." "It's not important now," Isaiah interjected. "Everyone's safe. That's what matters." Reynolds studied his chief training captain with admiration. "Your professionalism continues to impress me, Isaiah. Not everyone would be so gracious." As their conversation concluded, Isaiah excused himself to check on Jordan and complete required post-emergency paperwork. As he crossed the terminal, he found himself face to face with Garrett and Beverly Preston, who had evidently been working up the courage to approach him. For a moment, the three stood in awkward silence, the weight of the earlier interaction hanging between them. Then, Garrett extended his hand, his expression a complex mixture of shame, gratitude, and humility. "Captain Washington," he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "We owe you an apology. And our lives. Beverly, tears welling in her eyes, nodded in agreement. We were wrong. So terribly wrong. Isaiah looked at them for a long moment, seeing beyond their immediate contrition to the lifetime of privilege and prejudice that had shaped their worldview. Then, with the same steady professionalism that had carried them safely through the crisis, he accepted Garrett's outstretched hand. Everyone deserves to feel safe when they fly, he said, simply. That's all I've ever focused on. As Isaiah continued on his way to complete his duties, the Prestons watched him go, the full magnitude of their misjudgment settling upon them. They had questioned this man's competence based solely on his race, never imagining that he was not just qualified, but exceptional. So exceptional that he had trained every pilot they had ever entrusted their lives to without question. It was a revelation that would force them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves long after the memory of the emergency landing had faded. The St. John's Airport. Hilton hummed with subdued activity as passengers from Flight 1676 settled in for an unexpected overnight stay. Horizon Airlines had arranged accommodations for everyone affected by the emergency landing, with promises of a replacement aircraft arriving the following afternoon. In the hotel's restaurant, small groups of passengers gathered over meals, reliving their shared experience and forming the kind of temporary bonds that often emerge from collective brushes with mortality. Isaiah Washington sat alone at a corner table, picking at a club sandwich while reviewing technical documentation on his tablet. After completing all required post-emergency protocols and ensuring his crew was properly settled, he had finally allowed himself a moment of solitude to decompress. The adrenaline that had carried him through the crisis had long since dissipated, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that not even his years of experience could entirely prevent. Across the restaurant, Garrett and Beverly Preston sat at their own table nursing drinks while occasionally glancing in Isaiah's direction. Their earlier attempt at an apology had been brief and awkward, cut short by Isaiah's professional obligations. Now, with the immediate chaos behind them, the weight of their behavior pressed more heavily on their consciences. We need to talk to him properly, Beverly said quietly, her earlier panic replaced by genuine remorse. What we did was inexcusable. Garrett nodded, uncharacteristically subdued. Yes, but will he even want to hear it? If I were in his position, I wouldn't give us the time of day. We have to try, Beverly insisted. After what he did for us, for everyone on that plane. The couple's conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Kayla Bennett, who had entered the restaurant with several other crew members. Spotting her, Beverly impulsively waved her over. Miss Bennett, she began hesitantly as the flight attendant approached their table. Could I ask you something? Kayla regarded them with professional politeness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course, Mrs. Preston. Do you think Captain Washington would speak with us? We'd like to apologize properly for our behavior. Kayla glanced toward Isaiah's solitary figure, then back to the Prestons. Captain Washington is a consummate professional, she replied carefully. But he's also a human being who just piloted a severely damaged aircraft to a safe landing after a 12-hour duty day. Perhaps tomorrow might be better. Of course, Garrett said quickly. We understand. It's just important to us. Kayla studied them for a moment, sensing a genuine shift in their attitude. I'll mention that you'd like to speak with him, but the decision will be his. As Kayla moved away to join her colleagues, Isaiah looked up from his tablet and caught her eye. She approached his table and leaned down to speak quietly. The Prestons would like to speak with you, Captain. I told them tomorrow might be better. Isaiah sighed, setting down his tablet. What's your read on them, Bennett? They seem genuinely remorseful, Kayla replied honestly. But you don't owe them your time, especially not tonight. Isaiah considered this, then nodded. Thank you. I'll handle it. After Kayla departed, Isaiah sat for several more minutes weighing his options. Throughout his career, he had encountered countless instances of prejudice, ranging from subtle assumptions to overt discrimination. His standard approach had always been to rise above it, to let his performance speak for itself. But tonight, exhausted from the ordeal, and perhaps emboldened by the undeniable proof of his skill, he felt a rare impulse to address the situation directly. Decision made, he gathered his tablet, picked up his half-finished sandwich plate, and crossed the restaurant to the Prestons' table. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice neutral but not unfriendly. Garrett and Beverly looked up in surprise, both straightening in their seats. "Please," Captain Garrett said quickly, gesturing to an empty chair. "We'd be honored." Isaiah settled into the chair, placing his plate and tablet on the table. An awkward silence fell as the Prestons struggled to find the right words. "I understand you wanted to speak with me," Isaiah said, finally helping them along. Beverly nodded, her eyes moist with unshed tears. "We wanted to apologize, Captain Washington. What we did, what we said before the flight, was inexcusable." "It was prejudiced and wrong," Garrett added, forcing himself to meet Isaiah's gaze directly. "We judged you based solely on your race, and there's no justification for that." Isaiah studied them both, his expression thoughtful. "May I ask you something? And I'd appreciate honesty, not just what you think I want to hear." The Prestons nodded in unison. "If you had boarded that plane and seen a white pilot of my age with the same uniform and rank, would you have questioned his qualifications?" The directness of the question caught them off guard. Garrett opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally admitted, "No, we wouldn't have." "That's racial bias," Isaiah stated matter-of-factly, "and it happens to black professionals in every industry every day. The assumption that we couldn't possibly be qualified for the positions we hold." Beverly dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "We know that now, and we're deeply ashamed. I don't share this to make you feel worse." Isaiah continued, his tone remaining even. "But I want you to understand something about what it means to be a black pilot. Every day I walk through airports and see the surprise in people's eyes when they realize I'm the captain. Every day I know that some passengers feel less safe simply because of my skin color, despite my qualifications." He paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. "I was 8 years old when I decided I wanted to be a pilot. My father took me to an air show and I fell in love with flight. But even at that young age, I noticed something: none of the pilots looked like me. Not one." The Prestons listened in silence, the reality of Isaiah's experience sinking in. "When I started flight school, I was one of 3 black students in a class of 87. When I joined the Air Force, the statistics weren't much better. And now, after 23 years of flying, black pilots make up less than 3% of commercial aviators." Isaiah leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what that means? It means that every time I step into a cockpit, I'm not just flying a plane. I'm carrying the weight of being an exception, of having to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified." Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We never thought about it that way." "Most people don't," Isaiah acknowledged. "And that's part of the problem. The assumptions you made about me weren't formed in a vacuum. They're part of a systemic issue that affects countless professionals of color." Beverly wiped away a tear. "After what you did today, saving all our lives, I can't believe we ever questioned you." "That's just it, though," Isaiah replied, a hint of fatigue creeping into his voice. "I shouldn't have had to save your lives to earn your respect. My credentials, my uniform, my position as captain, those should have been enough." The truth of his words hung in the air between them. Around them, other passengers from the flight had begun to notice their conversation, some watching with undisguised interest. "You're right," Garrett said, finally, his normally confident voice subdued. "And I don't know how to make it right." Isaiah considered this. Making it right isn't about a single apology. It's about recognizing these biases and actively working against them, not just with pilots, but with everyone you encounter professionally. At a nearby table, Jordan Martinez had been watching the exchange with several other crew members. Seeing Isaiah engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with the very passengers who had questioned his competence, Jordan stood up, concern evident on his face. "Captain," he called, approaching their table.
Is everything okay here?
Isaiah nodded. Everything's fine, Martinez. Mr. and Mrs. Preston and I were just having an important conversation. Jordan glanced skeptically at the Prestons. If you're sure, sir. I am Isaiah confirmed, appreciating his first officer's protectiveness. As Jordan reluctantly returned to his table, Beverly looked at Isaiah with newfound understanding.
Your colleagues respect you enormously, don't they?
We've flown together many times, Isaiah replied simply. In aviation, trust is built through demonstrated competence, not assumptions. Garrett, who had been quiet for a moment, suddenly reached for his wallet. Captain Washington, we want to make this right somehow. Please let us. No, Isaiah interrupted firmly as Garrett began to extract what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash. I don't want your money. Garrett froze, clearly unaccustomed to having financial gestures rejected. I didn't mean to offend. You can't buy your way out of confronting bias, Isaiah stated plainly. That's not how this works. By now, their conversation had drawn the attention of most of the restaurant. Several passengers from the flight had edged closer, forming an impromptu audience to the confrontation. Among them were people of various backgrounds, many nodding in silent agreement with Isaiah's words. One woman, a professor from Howard University who had been seated in economy class, stepped forward. If I may, she said, addressing the Prestons, what Captain Washington is describing isn't unique to aviation. As a black woman in academia, I face the same assumptions every day that I'm less qualified, that I received my position through affirmative action rather than merit. A black businessman from Boston joined in. Same in corporate America. 20 years of experience, MBA from Wharton, and I still get mistaken for support staff in my own company's headquarters. What had begun as a private conversation was transforming into something larger, a moment of collective testimony about the reality of racial bias in professional settings. The Prestons, now the focus of multiple gazes, appeared increasingly uncomfortable, yet unable to disengage from the truth being presented to them. We never intended. Beverly began weakly. Intent isn't the point, Isaiah said, his voice gentle but firm. Impact is what matters. And the impact of these biases, these assumptions, is that qualified professionals face barriers that others don't have to overcome. Garrett, whose wealth and status had insulated him from many uncomfortable truths throughout his life, seemed genuinely shaken. What can we do? He asked the question, surprisingly vulnerable, coming from a man of his usual confidence. Isaiah considered this. Start by examining your assumptions. When you meet a black professional doctor, lawyer, pilot professor, check your initial reactions. Ask yourself if you'd have the same reaction to someone white in that position, and then actively work against those biases. He rose from the table, signaling the end of the conversation. It's been a long day for all of us. I suggest we get some rest before tomorrow's flight. As Isaiah prepared to leave, Garrett stood as well, extending his hand once more. Thank you, Captain Washington. Not just for saving our lives, but for this conversation. We needed to hear it. Isaiah accepted the handshake, noting the sincerity in Garrett's eyes that hadn't been there during their earlier interaction. Good night, Mr. and Mrs. Preston. As he walked away, the restaurant gradually returned to its previous state conversations, resuming, though now, with a different quality, more reflective, more aware of the deeper currents that had been exposed. Isaiah rejoined his crew, who welcomed him with supportive nods and quiet acknowledgments of what they had witnessed. Though exhausted, he felt a subtle shift within himself, a sense that perhaps beyond the technical triumph of landing a crippled aircraft, he had achieved something equally meaningful in that conversation with the Prestons. Whether it would last beyond the emotional aftermath of the emergency remained to be seen, but for tonight at least, Isaiah Washington had done more than save lives. He had spoken his truth, and it had been heard. 3 months after the emergency landing of Flight 1676, The grand ballroom of the Horizon Airlines corporate headquarters in Chicago glittered with light and conversation. Executives in formal attire mingled with pilots in dress uniforms, flight attendants, and ground crew members who had been specifically invited to this prestigious event. Above the stage hung a banner that read, "Celebrating 20 years of excellence, honoring Captain Isaiah Washington." The occasion marked not only Isaiah's 2 decades of service with Horizon, but also his promotion to the newly created position of Executive Director of Flight Operations, a role that would give him unprecedented influence over the airline's training programs, safety protocols, and corporate culture. At a table near the front of the room, Isaiah sat with Tamara, resplendent in a deep blue evening gown, and their daughter Zoe, now a high school senior, with her father's quiet confidence and her mother's analytical mind. Around them were Jordan Martinez and his family, Kayla Bennett, and several other crew members from Flight 1676, whose shared experience had forged a bond that transcended typical professional relationships. CEO Franklin Reynolds approached the podium as the room quieted in anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and distinguished guests, thank you for joining us tonight to honor an extraordinary aviator and an even more extraordinary human being. Reynolds recounted Isaiah's career, highlights his Air Force service, his rapid rise through Horizon's ranks, the training program that had revolutionized the airline's safety record, and of course, the now famous emergency landing that aviation experts had deemed virtually impossible given the cascade of system failures. But tonight, Reynolds continued, "We celebrate more than Captain Washington's technical brilliance. We celebrate his vision for a more inclusive aviation industry, one that recognizes talent regardless of background." He gestured toward a table at the side of the room where several young pilots of diverse backgrounds sat in their cadet uniforms. Isaiah's new diversity initiative has already brought us 15 cadets who otherwise might never have had the opportunity to pursue careers in aviation. And this is just the beginning. As applause filled the room, the doors at the back opened quietly to admit 2 late arrivals. Garrett and Beverly Preston, elegant in evening wear, but notably more subdued than they had appeared on that fateful flight, slipped into seats at a rear table. Their presence wasn't coincidental. After returning to New York following the emergency landing, the Prestons had undergone a genuine transformation, the kind that sometimes occurs only after a profound shock to one's worldview. Their near-death experience, combined with the revelation of their own biases and Isaiah's dignified confrontation, had sparked a period of uncomfortable but necessary self-examination. Beverly had reached out to Horizon's corporate offices a month after the incident, not to complain as she might once have done, but to inquire about supporting programs for underrepresented youth interested in aviation. This led to her involvement with the Bessie Coleman Initiative, a community organization providing mentorship and scholarship opportunities for minority students pursuing careers in flight. Garrett, meanwhile, had done something equally out of character for his former self. After several conversations with black colleagues at his investment firm Conversations he had never bothered to initiate before he had established a substantial scholarship fund specifically for black students pursuing commercial pilot certification, with Isaiah's name attached to it, without the captain's prior knowledge. As Reynolds concluded his remarks, he made an announcement that caught Isaiah by surprise. "And now I'd like to invite someone special to the stage to unveil an initiative that Captain Washington hasn't been briefed on yet. Mr. Garrett Preston, please join us." A murmur ran through the crowd as Garrett made his way to the podium. Many in the room knew the story of the Prestons' complaint before Flight 1676, either through airline gossip or media coverage of the emergency landing, which had included some carefully worded references to passenger concerns. Prior to takeoff, Garrett looked momentarily uncomfortable under the collective gaze, but his voice was steady as he began to speak. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Captain Washington, Mrs. Washington. Distinguished guests, I stand before you tonight as someone who has learned a difficult but valuable lesson about prejudice and its consequences." He paused, gathering himself visibly before continuing. 3 months ago, my wife and I boarded Flight 1676, and upon seeing Captain Washington in the cockpit, immediately questioned his qualifications based solely on the color of his skin. There is no excuse for our behavior, and I offer none. What I offer instead is an acknowledgement of the harm that such biases cause, not just in aviation, but across all professions. The room had gone completely silent, the unexpected candor of his confession commanding everyone's attention. Hours after we questioned his abilities, Captain Washington saved our lives and the lives of everyone on that aircraft through extraordinary skill that few pilots of any background could have matched. The irony that we had doubted the very man responsible for training every Horizon captain we'd ever flown, with the very man whose protocols protect every passenger on every flight, is not lost on us. Garrett turned slightly to address Isaiah directly. "Captain Washington, after our conversation in Street Johns, my wife and I committed to doing more than offering empty apologies. We committed to action." He gestured, and an assistant brought forward a large presentation check. "Today we are announcing the establishment of the Isaiah Washington Flight Academy, a fully funded program that will provide complete pilot training for 50 students from underrepresented backgrounds each year, covering everything from initial certification through commercial licensing. The Preston Foundation has endowed this program with $50 million to ensure its operation in perpetuity." Gasps and applause erupted around the room. Isaiah, typically composed in all circumstances, appeared genuinely stunned. Tamara reached for his hand under the table, squeezing it tightly as tears shone in her eyes. Garrett continued, "Additionally, we have partnered with 10 major corporations to establish guaranteed interviews for all graduates, addressing not just the training barrier, but also the employment barrier that too often follows." As the applause subsided, Beverly joined her husband at the podium. "We can't undo our actions that day," she said, her voice carrying surprising strength. "But we can work to ensure that the next generation of pilots reflects the full diversity of our society, and that talent, not privilege or prejudice, determines who flies our aircraft." Reynolds returned to the microphone, inviting Isaiah to the stage. As he rose from his seat, the entire room stood with him, erupting in a standing ovation that continued as he made his way forward. At the podium, Isaiah embraced first Beverly and then Garrett, an unscripted gesture that visibly moved many in the audience. When the applause finally quieted, he adjusted the microphone and surveyed the room with characteristic thoughtfulness. "When I was a child dreaming of flight," he began, "I never imagined standing here today. Not because I doubted my abilities, but because I rarely saw pilots who looked like me. I had to believe I belonged in a cockpit, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise." He gestured toward the cadet table. "The young people in this room tonight won't have to wonder if they belong. They'll know they do because we're making space for them, creating pathways where barriers once stood." Isaiah turned to the Prestons. "Mr. and Mrs. Preston, your generosity will change lives, and I'm honored by your commitment to this cause. But the most meaningful aspect of your gift isn't financial. It's your willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and then take action. That transformation is what gives me hope." Returning his attention to the broader audience, Isaiah continued, "The emergency landing of Flight 1676 has been called miraculous by some, but it wasn't a miracle. It was the result of training preparation and the collective efforts of our entire crew." He acknowledged Jordan Kayla and the other Flight 1676 crew members with a nod. Similarly, the work of creating a more equitable aviation industry isn't magical or mysterious. It requires intentional effort, honest confrontation of biases, and concrete actions to dismantle barriers. He gestured toward the banner above. "Excellence isn't just about how well we fly planes. It's about how we treat each other, how we respond when we're wrong, and how we create opportunities for those who come after us. The room erupted in applause once more as Isaiah concluded his remarks. As he returned to his seat, he found himself thinking about the extraordinary journey from that tense moment in the first-class cabin 3 months ago to tonight's announcement. Later, as the formal program concluded and guests mingled during the reception, Isaiah found himself face to face with the Prestons once more. "We weren't sure if we should come tonight," Beverly admitted. "We didn't want to make the evening about us or our journey." Isaiah smiled. "Your presence matters. It demonstrates that change is possible, that conversations, even difficult ones, can lead to transformation." Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about something you said in Street Johns, that you shouldn't have had to save our lives to earn our respect. You were right, and that realization has changed how I interact with everyone, not just pilots." "That's the real victory," Isaiah replied. "More meaningful than any landing or promotion." As they continued their conversation, Zoe approached with Jordan's teenage son, Michael, both clearly excited about something. "Dad," Zoe began, her eyes bright, "Michael and I were talking to those cadets from the flight academy, and they asked if you'd be willing to meet with their student aviation club next month. They said you're their hero." Isaiah looked from his daughter to the diverse group of young cadets across the room, their faces shining with the particular light of those who have found their calling. In their expressions, he saw reflections of his younger self, the boy who had looked up at planes and dreamed, despite never seeing pilots who resembled him. "Of course I will," he said, feeling a profound sense of completion. "It would be my honor." As the evening drew to a close, Isaiah stood with Tamara near the windows overlooking the illuminated airport runway in the distance. Aircraft lights moved across the darkness, taking off, landing, connecting people and places across vast distances. 20 years, Tamara mused, leaning against his shoulder. Did you ever imagine it would lead here? Isaiah watched the rhythmic pattern of the runway lights, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The challenges overcome, the barriers broken, the lives touched, and yes, saved. "No," he admitted, "but I'm grateful for every part of it, even the difficult moments, especially those." From cockpit to classroom to corporate leadership, Isaiah Washington had transformed not just his own life, but countless others through his commitment to excellence and equity. And in the most unexpected way, a moment of prejudice had blossomed into an opportunity for profound change. Proof that even at 39,000 feet, with systems failing and lives in the balance, the most important journey is the dead, one toward understanding. Isaiah Washington's story teaches us powerful truths about prejudice, excellence, and transformation. Racism often operates through assumptions about competence, forcing people of color to constantly prove themselves worthy of positions they've already earned. The Preston's journey reveals how biases can blind us to the very excellence that might save our lives. True change requires more than apologies. It demands honest self-examination and concrete action. Isaiah's philosophy of excellence as resistance demonstrates how exceptional performance can challenge prejudice. Yet, his confrontation reminds us that no one should need to save lives to deserve basic respect and dignity. The story also highlights the ripple effects of both discrimination and redemption. One pilot's experience became the catalyst for creating opportunities for countless future aviators from underrepresented backgrounds. The aviation industry, like many professional fields, can only reach its full potential when talent from all backgrounds is recognized and developed. Perhaps most importantly, the narrative shows us that transformation is possible. Even deeply held biases can be overcome through genuine confrontation with truth and the humility to change course when proven wrong. Have you ever witnessed prejudice transform into understanding? Has an experience completely changed your perspective on someone you misjudged? Comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to like this video if Isaiah's story moved you. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that challenge discrimination and celebrate resilience. Share with someone who needs to hear this message today. Thank you for watching. And remember, our most powerful growth often comes from confronting our most uncomfortable truths.